Ronald the Rules Lawyer. We're going to do the strange, nerdy, yet oddly satisfying exercise of figuring out what is the deadliest and most hardcore edition of D&D and its descendant Pathfinder, and we're going to do it by reading rules and doing math. And along the way, I'll also point out that most people playing 1st edition AD&D are playing it wrong. This is me doing another horizontal slice, looking at a specific thing in D&D and Pathfinder history, like my other video, looking at undead draining your experience levels. Goodness, Megan. Arriving on cue, of course. Oh, here's Megan. Oh. I'm just fascinated by the history, and also by the old editions of the game that I read wistfully as a preteen, but never got a chance to play much of. Who the fuck am I? I am Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I am a lawyer who runs tabletop role-playing games. I mostly run Pathfinder 2e. Please support my Patreon. I don't make money as an attorney. For an explanation of why, look at this video whose thumbnail is on the screen. Supporting it gives you early access to most of my videos and exclusive content. Now, what will be my methodology? First, I'll look at the rules for death and dying in each edition. I'll math out the odds that a specific creature, specifically the bugbear, will one-shot a level 1 character at full health. I picked the bugbear because it's notorious in 5e for being in a very popular adventure and killing off a lot of characters. And I'll look at other things in each edition that I feel are appropriate for this analysis. Let's start with the granddaddy, the original Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. When you hit 0 hit points, you die. These earlier editions don't take much explaining, do they? And also, you didn't get maximum hit points at first level. You could start, even as a fighter, with 1 or 2 hit points. And if you were a magic user in this system, by the time of the first supplement, Greyhawk, you had only 1 to 4 hit points. So you started with an average of 2.5 hit points. It was a common joke in the early days that a domestic house cat could kill a wizard, and falling down a 10-foot pit, which did 1 to 6 points of damage, was more likely to kill you than not. Now let's take our original D&D bugbear, and yes, that's what it looked like in the book. It's going to attack a level 1 fighting man with plate armor and a shield, which they can afford in this edition, so they have an armor class of 2. In the early days, lower was better. The bugbear, having 3+1 hit dice, I won't explain, long story, hits the fighting man by rolling a 13 or higher, or 40% chance. And it does 1 to 6 damage against this fighting man with 1 to 8 hit points. After all the math, this attack has a 12.5% chance of killing them. Now, what about our poor magic user with 1 to 4 hit points? After all the math, it is a 56.3% chance. And by the way, falling down a 10-foot pit has a 75% fatality rate for the magic user. This is pretty brutal. Keep your magic user in the back. And you're all pretty fragile, so you probably want to hire a bunch of hirelings, to go into the dungeon with you at this time. It's interesting to see how deadly the game is at this point, because remember, the designers were designers of war games involving big set-piece battles with lots of soldiers, and they called D&D a war game in its early days. In these games, you didn't track hit points of individual soldiers. A hit in war games meant you died. And hit points for individual fighters was a new concept with D&D. Now, what tier will we put original D&D in, with S being the deadliest? Well, S obviously. Now, is it the deadliest edition of D&D? We'll see. The next edition, and we're going through these chronologically by the way, is AD&D, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which came out between 1977 and 79. The core books were published over those 3 years. Well, here you also die at 0 hit points, and some of you are like, wait, what? You may remember AD&D being more generous. Isn't that the one where you die at -10 hit points and your allies can bandage you if you're at negative HP? If that's how you played, you were playing it wrong. I cite my sources. Player's Handbook, page 105. It says, if any creature reaches 0 or negative hit points, it is dead. You can't get more unambiguous than that. That's not how most people played AD&D, and there's this post on EN World by Snarf Zagig explaining why many people played that way. As it turns out, surprise, surprise, Gary Gygax wrote contradictory rules. The Dungeon Master's Guide, which came out a year after the language I just showed you, had this section called 0 hit points. It says, when any creature is brought to 0 hit points, optionally as low as -3 hit points if from the same blow which brought the total to 0, it is unconscious. So already he's contradicting the Player's Handbook. If you're brought to 0 hit points and this section is called 0 hit points, you don't die, you are just unconscious. Optionally, they can be knocked down to -3. So that's an optional, official optional rule. The window that the Dungeon Master can allow you to still survive is only that narrow band between 0 and -3, if even that. And only then do you go on to the next sentence. It says, in each of the next succeeding rounds, 1 additional negative hit point will be lost until -10 is reached and the creature dies. And in the meantime, an ally can bandage you up. Because the language here is so abstruse, many people just simply assumed you don't die until you reach -10 and took it as that. And unsurprising, because the game was very deadly and players and dungeon masters didn't want characters to bite the dust so quickly. People were already fighting against the lethality of the game. Still, Gary Gygax says if you are revived, you are out of commission for, well, you're in a coma for 10 to 60 minutes, first of all, but even after that, you're basically useless as an adventurer. You cannot attack, defend, or cast spells, and you need to rest for a full week before you can be a useful adventurer again. And that's only if your character was knocked out and hit 0 hit points exactly by his default rule, or that tiny sweet spot. So AD&D was still quite deadly indeed. Noteworthy, because this is a thorough review, fighters did get a bump to their hit dice from D8 to D10, and thieves got a boost from D4 to D6. But our poor magic user is still stuck with a D4, and so still starts with an average of 2.5 hit points. Now let's take our AD&D bugbear going against our level 1 fighter, who typically can afford splinted mail and a shield. The bugbear has a 40% chance of hitting that armor class of 3. Note that I'm not using the rules for hitting different armor types. They were needlessly complex, very few people use them, and they give me a headache, and they would complicate my work, to be honest. So I don't want it. The AD&D bugbear does somewhat more damage, does 2d4 or 2 to 8. The fighter got an HP boost, now has 1 to 10 hit points, and also does not die at exactly 0 HP. So the bugbear's attack has a 16% chance of killing the fighter, and if we require the bugbear to take the fighter down to -4 to kill the fighter, then it is only a 5% chance. Now what about attacking the squishy magic user with an armor class of 10? Well, that's a 63.3% chance of killing the magic user, and under the optional rule, it is 23.4%. So the lethality was similar, unless you as the Dungeon Master were more permissive, which the Dungeon Master's Guide invited you to be. Another important thing affecting the lethality of this edition is that clerics, unlike before, actually could cast spells at level 1. At first level, they got 1 spell slot, but having a high wisdom, at least a 13, which was very likely in AD&D the way it generates ability scores, you could get bonus spell slots. It was very common for a cleric to choose to commit their 3 spell slots in the morning to 3 castings of Cure Light Wounds. Now what tier does AD&D First Edition go under? Now I have to think that the vast majority of DMs, correct me if I'm wrong, at least use Gary Gygax's optional variant rule, requiring that it be knocked down below -3 hit points. And that many, maybe the majority, simply had you die at -10 no matter how you got there. This poses a challenge to tier making, because it's unclear which rules people were actually using. I'll also have to take into consideration that AD&D did have more generous ability score generation methods. In original D&D, you rolled 3d6 down the line, but now the DM was given various methods which were all more generous than the original. One of them being roll 4d6 and drop the lowest and arrange your ability scores as desired. Taking all this into consideration, I'll put it in A tier. It was still deadly as fuck. Next is Basic Dungeons & Dragons, which officially became a separate yet parallel system in 1981. The reason is rooted in the financial feud between the two creators. Basically, Gary told Dave, hey, here's your edition to get royalties off of while we focus more on advanced D&D. Many people, including a young me, looked down on it as, oh, that's the kiddie edition, not the full advanced edition.
I won Dungeons & Dragons, and it was advanced.
It has fewer rules. Look how thin this book is, and compare it to the advanced version. Look how thick that is. But this so-called kiddie edition of the game was the more brutal one for those hardcore enough to take it on. It basically continued original D&D, dead at 0 hit points, period, full stop. You also rolled your ability scores 3d6 down the line. However, it was a little easier to get bonuses to your armor class and hit points. You only needed a 13 as opposed to a 15 before to get a +1, for example. Still, our poor magic user was still stuck with 1 to 4 hit points. What about our bugbear test? Well, in basic D&D, the bugbear does the increased damage of 2d4 compared to original D&D. So the chance of one-shotting a full health fighter has increased to 21.9%. And it had a 65.6% chance of squishing the wizard. So the numbers have gone up from original D&D, at least for the bugbear. But I have to say, from my relatively short review and comparison of some monsters between these two editions, it looked like basic D&D gave the monsters some more offensive power, some increases in damage or multiple attacks. Now, worth mentioning before we go any further is that in these early editions, poison was fatal. You made a saving throw against poison, and if you failed, you died. Here's the saving throws chart. You rolled a d20 and you did not get any bonuses to this roll. At level 1, if you were exposed to poison, most characters were more likely than not going to die. Good chance you'll croak from a giant spider if its bite damage didn't kill you already. Look how high these other numbers were that you needed to roll to avoid being turned to stone or have other awful things happen to you. Now, what tier is this? We can confidently put this into S tier. Next is AD&D 2nd edition. The rules here are similar to 1st edition, but more lenient. It still says that when a character reaches 0 hit points, that character is slain. However, there's an optional rule in the Dungeon Master's Guide that is more generous. It implements how many people had misunderstood or house ruled the game before. It says a character remains alive until his hit points reach -10, period. Going down to 0 or less knocks you unconscious. If you're knocked unconscious and are revived, you are basically useless as an adventurer. You're generally confused and feverish, can only hold somewhat disjointed conversations, but no casting spells or fighting. You need 1 day of rest to recover. Which, okay, if you think about it, being knocked out in a brutal battle should have some effect on your ability to continue. But something new that wasn't in the first, a new way to kill players, is the massive damage rule. If you ever take 50 or more points of damage from a single attack, you must roll a successful saving throw versus death or die. That's the same roll as a saving throw against poison, by the way, they're grouped together. Obviously not very relevant until you get to higher levels and have more hit points and you start encountering very powerful monsters in the upper echelons of the game that can deal such damage. Now, all these rules that we've seen in 2e lead to an interesting dynamic that becomes more pronounced in 3e. As you level up, you get tougher. However, it also means that monsters now do more damage at higher levels, and particularly if you are at low hit points as a character, those monsters are more likely to instantly kill you because they do more damage. For example, a very old red dragon can, with its fire breath, inflict, on average, a little over 100 points of damage. You can die from either of these rules. Not only might that instantly kill you if your hit points are low, but even if you're at full health and you succeed on your saving throw and reduce that damage by half, you might instantly die. In case you're wondering, our level 1 magic user still has 1 to 4 hit points. Now, our bugbear test. The bugbear still does 2d4 or 2 to 8 damage in this edition. If it were to attack our fighter, and we were to go by the default rule of dying at 0 hit points, then that has a 17.5% chance of killing the fighter. 0% chance if we use the official optional rule. Note that in 1st edition, being brought down to exactly 0 hit points just knocked you unconscious. I believe the DMG superseded the player's handbook. However, the bugbear became slightly less accurate in this edition. I don't know if that's consistent across the board with monsters, and so the percentage is still similar. But yeah, it simply wasn't possible to roll 2d4 damage and take that fighter down to -10. I'll note that the DMG in this edition had an optional critical hit system. One of the ways you can adjudicate a natural 20 was to apply double damage. However, I won't incorporate it into this chart. It would make it too complex, and I don't think that optional rule was used nearly as much as the die at -10 rule, I think. Now, against the magic user, that's a 65.6% chance of killing if you go under the default rule, but under the optional rule, it's still 0%. No way of taking that magic user down to -10. Now, as for the state of poison in 2nd edition, what used to be death when you failed your saving throw has now been replaced by this chart. The strength column shows what happens if you fail your saving throw on the left and what happens if you succeed on the right. That number is the amount of damage you'll take if it's not instant death. Most of them do damage. However, it's a lot of damage if you fail your saving throw. 15, 20, 25, which at low levels will instantly kill you. So still very lethal, but not as lethal as 1st edition. Now, what tier should 2E go under? Well, it seems to be less deadly than 1st edition. I imagine the die at -10 hit points became ubiquitous among the player base at this time. And further, it's now an official variant rule, as opposed to before. So B tier? Nah, I still put it at A tier. I'm going to leave room for the other editions. I think in the grand scheme of things, it's important to keep a space between these older editions and 3rd edition D&D in 2000, which I describe as a leap forward, even a revolution in the game in one of my videos. The change between the old school and the new school, at least in terms of the rules design. Let's look at the rules. Well, the optional rule in 2nd edition, hovering at that store, now becomes a default rule. You only die at -10 hit points, period. In the corner case of being brought down to exactly 0 hit points, you become what's called disabled. You can only do half of your actions, and anything strenuous means you lose a hit point and are dying. While dying, every time your turn comes up, you have a 10% chance of stabilizing. Otherwise, you lose a hit point and are brought closer to that -10. An ally can now use the heal skill to stabilize you. You need a 15 on the roll. Skills are now fully systematized in this edition. What's notably missing here is anything limiting your ability to be an adventurer once you're revived. Being nearly frickin' killed is no longer debilitating. Realism be damned. We're big damn heroes, and this is a game.
Big damn heroes, sir!
Ain't we just?
From this point forward, we never see limits on your ability to adventure after you're knocked out again. Another important thing that starts with this edition is that you get maximum hit points as if you rolled the highest number on your hit die at level 1. It apparently was a very popular house rule before that 3rd edition made into a rule. This combined with the fact that it became easier to get numerical bonuses from your statistics. It was now significantly easier to get bonus hit points and armor class adjustments. And because 4d6 dropped the lowest or range your scores as desired has now become the default rule, we're going to assume characters from now on have a 12 constitution and 12 dexterity, giving a bonus hit point per level and a +1 bonus to AC. Our wizard finally has more than 2.5 hit points, now has 5. Bugbear time. It now does 1d8 plus 2 damage. Versus our fighter with scale mail, I'm assuming our fighter has a 12 constitution, so starts with 11 hit points. So to bring them down to -10, this bugbear needs to inflict 21 points of damage with one blow. Not possible. So a 0% chance. Even with a crit, the bugbear can only do 20 points of damage at most. Now, I admit here there probably was a better monster to be a comparator across the editions than the bugbear, because it's wielding a Morning Star, which is kind of under the curve damage-wise for its challenge rating of 2. If I had chosen the Orc wielding the Great Axe, which did 1 to 12 damage and does triple damage on a critical hit, this would be a different story entirely. But that has the problem of being too lethal for its level, so what can you do? Moving on. Now against our wizard with 5 hit points, the bugbear needs to inflict 15 points of damage, so a regular hit cannot kill the wizard. But if the bugbear does a critical hit, rolling a natural 20 and doing a confirmation roll, a second roll that has to meet the target's AC, the chance of rolling 15 damage is 32.8%. But that requires critting, so the final percentage chance that this bugbear will one-shot the wizard is 1.1%. The bugbear's attack bonus was +4, by the way, if you want to do the math. So again, we have the near elimination of one-shot killing level 1 characters if you follow the rule that you only die at -10. But that -10 rule for the first time is the default rule. The massive damage rule lives on. 50 points of damage forces the target to do a fortitude saving throw, DC 15, to not die. But my impression is that 3rd edition damage scaling is bigger than in 2nd edition, correct me if I'm wrong, so this condition is more likely to be met. Meanwhile, magical healing is quite available in this edition. A level 1 cleric is likely going to have 2 first level spell slots and 3 cantrip slots. There is a cantrip in this edition that heals 1 hit point, though cantrips are not at will in this edition. You fire and forget them. Meanwhile, poison is much weaker in this edition than before, at least less fatal. They're less likely to kill, but more likely to debilitate you. It applied ability damage to one of your ability scores, and each exposure could apply this damage to you twice. What sucked is that you could only get 1 point back with a night's rest, 2 with 24 hours rest, but it likely wasn't lethal. Now what tier do we put this in? Well, dying at -10 being a default rule is a big deal, but it was an official and extremely popular variant rule in the previous edition. But you also now get maximum hit points at 1st level, and something I haven't mentioned yet is that you also get to get a full hit die at every level up to 20. Previously, you'd reach a level, say 9th level or so, where your character gets their last hit die. And after that, they only get a flat bonus. Fighters get 3 hit points, magic users get 1 hit point per level, without any constitution score bonus. So your hit points continue to go like this, whereas before they kind of flattened out. Plus being able to continue adventuring after you were knocked out, and the fact that lethal effects are not so lethal, makes me put this at B tier. Alright, now we get to D&D 4th edition, the controversial edition. The one I looked down on when I was a new game master starting out in 2010. I was a Pathfinder partisan in the then edition war. But I now quite enjoy it, and I ran a short tester campaign on my channel, and I'm now running a level 1 to 30 Dungeon Delve campaign. I'll include links to them in the description. 4E was the edition that wiped the slate clean and redesigned the system from the ground up. And characters were tougher and more heroic, even super heroic, starting at level 1. But I won't go into their powers, I'm going to just look at the death and dying rules. When you drop to 0 hit points or fewer, you fall unconscious and are dying. You die when your hit points reach your bloodied value expressed as a negative number, which is a fancy way of saying negative half your maximum hit points. So if you have 100 maximum hit points, you die at -50. The rest will sound pretty familiar to 5e players. A lot of things were pioneered in 4e that live on in 5e. If you're dying and your turn comes up, you roll a d20. If you roll lower than 10, you have a failure. If you roll 3 failures since your last rest, you can have 5-minute rests in the system, you die. If you roll 10 or higher 3 times, you keep rolling. There is no stabilizing from 3 successes in 4e. If you roll 20 or higher, you can spend a healing surge and get back into the fight. Now, healing surges are a daily resource in 4e that let you get 1/4 of your hit points back. But here, you return to 0 hit points. You could have been at -30. You return to 0 hit points and then get 1/4 of your hit points back. You need to have healing surges remaining to recover. Meanwhile, an ally can use the heal skill and roll a DC 15 check to stabilize you. 4e has no massive damage rule. That rule doesn't exist anymore. Additionally, player characters have much more hit points than before. You calculate your hit points by adding your constitution score, not your modifier, but your entire constitution score, to a number determined by your class. Our wizard has 10 plus constitution score. So let's say our wizard has a 10 constitution, which is lower than the previous, but I use it to illustrate how dramatic this changes. The wizard has 20 hit points at level 1. Meanwhile, 4e engineered the math so that monsters did not take a huge proportion of your hit points with a single blow. At low levels, the average damage from a single blow is about 8. So our bugbear, who is a level 5 creature, the bugbear brawler, does 1d12 plus 6 damage. Critical hits in 4e work like 5e. You basically take the dice and imagine you rolled a maximum number for them. So the maximum damage the bugbear can do is 18. Which is not even enough to knock down our level 1 wizard, let alone kill the wizard. That would take 30 points of damage in one blow. So it has a 0% chance of one-shot killing our fighter and wizard. Also, for the first time with this edition, the instant death threshold, your negative HP value that you die at, scaled with your character as you leveled up. This avoided the weirdness from before where higher level characters are presumably tougher, but could be more susceptible to lethal blows. Also, there's more in-combat healing in 4E. Every character, no matter what class you are, can spend a healing surge in the middle of combat by doing the action called Second Wind. You can do this once per encounter, you spend a healing surge, and increase your defenses for a round. Another big deal is that it's expected to have in your party makeup a leader class, the prototypical one being the cleric, and clerics have a power called Healing Word, which should look familiar to 5e players. It uses a minor action, which is kind of like bonus actions in 5e. So you can do your main action, called a standard action in 4e, and do this in addition. You make an ally within 25 feet, spend a healing surge, and regain an additional 1 to 6 hit points. And you could do this 2 times per encounter. Because this was a minor action, you could still do a big thing on your turn, like a big power or big attack, and bring back an ally who had been knocked out. This was a big deal. In addition to all this, parties generally had more what I call sustain during the day, which I think is a gaming term. You just had more of an ability to keep on trucking and keep adventuring because of your innate healing ability, your healing surges. Your class gave you 6 to 10 healing surges per day, at least in the first player's handbook, and you could add your con mod to that number. You can spend any number of your healing surges with a 5-minute short rest, with each surge restoring 1/4 of your hit points. So our level 1 wizard with a 10 constitution, so 6 daily healing surges, can count on 50 hit points in a given adventuring day. Lastly, instant death effects like poison and save or suck effects generally have been removed as far as I can tell. Generally, 4E represents poison as ongoing poison damage that you have about a 50% chance per turn of shaking off. Now what tier is this? Clearly F tier. In terms of deadliness, of course, that's all we're talking about here. It effectively eliminates the one-shot kill and implements a number of other changes. In my Dungeon Delve campaign, we're up to level 26 now, I believe. We have not had a single PC death, and we had one close call, but only after I house rolled in greater damage for the monsters. Now, this is only reflecting my group's experience, but I'm sure deaths have happened out there in 4E land. If they have, I'd love to hear about it in the comments and how it happened. Next is Pathfinder 1st Edition in 2009. Its mission statement was to continue D&D 3rd Edition to serve that part of the market that did not want to move on to 4E. It basically tweaked 3E's formulas. Instead of dying at minus 10 hit points, you died at a negative amount equal to your Constitution score, which usually was higher. Also, instead of a 10% chance of stabilizing, you rolled a Constitution check, you needed to get a 10 or higher, and you got a penalty to your roll equal to your negative hit point total. So if you're at minus 5 hit points and had a plus 2 Constitution modifier, you needed to roll a 13 on this die to stabilize. Generally much more generous and less dangerous than having to roll a 10% percentile roll. A natural 20 always succeeded, by the way. Also, you got a slight boost to your hit points compared to 3E. Wizards and sorcerers went up from a D4 to a D6, and rogues went from a D6 to a D8. Also, I didn't mention this, but 3E had a favored class mechanic meant to give you a small penalty for multiclassing, whereas 3E gave you a stick, a XP penalty if you went outside of your favorite class. Pathfinder 1E gave you a carrot. If you stuck to your initial class, you got a bonus hit point or skill point, which at first level, since you're quite fragile, nearly every player chose the hit point. So our level 1 wizard with a 12 constitution gets 6 hit points from being a wizard, 1 from constitution, and 1 from favorite class. So it starts with 8. As for our bugbear, well, it now does 1d8 plus 3 damage, 1 point more than 3E. It also has a plus 5 bonus to hit. Well, it has 0% chance of one-shotting our fighter, and a 0.4% chance of one-shotting our wizard. So that takes our 3E number and takes it even lower. The massive damage rule from 3E lives on, but it is now an optional rule. Also, it scales up at higher levels. You need to suffer half your total hit points or 50, whichever is higher. So it's a little more lenient. Meanwhile, clerics got a boost from before. They can now simultaneously convert any of their prepared spells to a cure spell, so allowing them to prepare a wider variety of spells at the start of the day. Cantrips are now at will, but you cannot heal hit points anymore. There is the stabilize cantrip, however, which can stabilize the dying, obviously. Also, clerics get to channel energy. They can do this 3 plus their charisma modifier per day, and if you're a positive energy cleric, you can heal with this energy, heal living creatures, 1d6 in a 30-foot radius. Now, where should we put this? It's definitely less lethal than 3E, but I don't want to put it at C. I still want to leave room for later additions. I put it at B tier. Let's call it low B tier. Compared to 3E, you get more hit points, it's easier to self-stabilize, and there are more ways for casters to help you. But you still die at negative constitution scores, so let's say you're at 8 hit points facing a ancient red dragon, you are in danger. And in my 8 years of being a Pathfinder 1st edition main, yeah, I did see a number of deaths. Orcs, ogres, and other low-level creatures can cut through low-level HP like butter. We now move on to D&D 5th edition, and I'm going to group 5.5e, the 2024 edition, with this one. The death and dying rules are basically a more generous version of what we have in 4e. Here's the instant death rule. If a single source of damage takes you to your negative maximum hit point total, then you die. So your full max HP, not half your max HP like in 4e. Notably though, you don't track negative hit points in 5e. For the first time, we dispense with that mechanic entirely. You have a death saving throw system like in 4e. You roll a 10 or higher to get a success. 3 failures means you die, but 3 successes stabilizes you. A natural 1 counts as 2 failures, and a natural 20 can, like before, revive you. You get 1 hit point this time, and you get to play out your turn. You don't track negative hit points, but any damage you take while down gives you another failure. And if it's a critical hit that damages you, you take 2 failures. Meanwhile, 5e characters don't have the big hit point totals that the previous edition of D&D had. They're back to 3e and Pathfinder 1st edition levels. Our level 1 wizard with a 12 constitution is likely to start with 7 hit points. 4e had you die if a single source of damage brought you down to negative half your maximum HP. But you also had a lot more hit points. The wizard in 4e needed 30 damage to be one shot, but here only needs 14. So 5e can be pretty deadly at low levels, especially at level 1. Now for our bugbear test, and again I chose the bugbear because there's a notorious bugbear in the Lost Mine of Phandelver, perhaps the most played 5e adventure module of all time. Notorious for killing PCs. To kill our level 1 fighter with 11 hit points, it needs to do 22 damage in one blow. But it does 2d8 plus 2 damage, and that's not enough, not even with a crit. However, it has a special ambush ability. If it can surprise the character in the first round, it gets an extra 2d6 damage. I've done the math, and that has a 12% chance of killing the fighter, so I put both numbers in the chart. Now for our poor wizard. Well, our 7 hit point wizard might get one shot by this bugbear even if there is no ambush. It can do a maximum of 18 damage after all, which can bring this wizard down to -7 easily. Without an ambush, it is a 20.2% chance of killing the wizard, and with the ambush, it is 60.5%. So I put both numbers on the screen and I've rounded in order to fit it in the chart. But it gets more complicated because in the 2024 edition, 5.5, they have nerfed this bugbear. It now only does 2d6 plus 2 damage, and it has no ambush ability. When I run the math, here are the numbers: 0% chance of killing the fighter, 6.8% chance of killing the wizard. So as it turns out, the original bugbear is kind of an outlier, something the designers wanted to correct, and also maybe the designers' intentions have evolved since the early days of 5e. Anyway, it all exposes the limitations of this experiment. Meanwhile, 5e has no massive damage rule separate from taking you down to negative maximum HP with one blow. Since the instant death rule relies on bringing you down to negative maximum HP, this becomes increasingly unlikely as you level up, and 5e becomes significantly less deadly after the first few levels. And like in 4e, the spell Healing Word exists. But this time it uses up your daily spell slots. It's not twice per encounter. And you only have a few spell slots at low levels. However, as you gain levels and get more spell slots, you get 15 spell slots by level 10. Combined with the fact that they've changed how prepared casting works, you can cast Healing Word so long as you have a spell slot. You can cast this multiple times in a tough fight. using your bonus action. You can still do your main action as well every turn. And unlike 4E, where you died if you accumulated 3 failed saving throws since your last rest, here in 5E, every time you come back up from 0, your counter resets. This has led to a criticism of 5E combat having yo-yo healing, where characters are frequently knocked out and brought back up again, often with just a bonus action. As for lethal effects in 5E, poison is basically expressed by additional poison damage. Poison doesn't have much of a unique mechanical identity, except in rare cases. Now, sometimes random BS can kill you in 5e, I'm looking at you, Shadows, but even if a character dies, you have Revivify, a 3rd level spell that only costs 1 action you can do in the middle of combat, and it costs 300 gold pieces, so 20% of the cost of a suit of plate armor. This brings the character back to life so long as a minute hasn't passed, and you can get up and get back into the fight again without penalties.
Big damn hero, sir!
Now, to be fair, Revivify originated in 3rd edition in a supplement, but there was a 5th level spell, and it cost 1,000 gold, and also you had to commit to each casting of the spell the way prepared spellcasting worked. Now, what tier do we put 5e in? This is very difficult to answer because even more than in previous editions, it feels like you're playing a different game as you leave the first levels. Now I've run some 5e, and my vibes tell me that at the first level or 2, it's kind of as deadly as 3e and Pathfinder 1st edition, and perhaps a little deadlier. So I'm going to put it in B tier for the first couple of levels only. But after that, death is quite avoidable. But I don't think you get to 4e levels of survivability, so I'm going to put the rest of 5e in D tier. Alright, I'm cheating a little there, but what can you do? Now we move on to Pathfinder 2e, which came out in 2019. And full disclosure, it is my preferred system. It's what my channel is centered on. So how does Pathfinder 2e measure up? Well, this is actually the most complicated one to explain. First off, like D&D 5e, this dispenses with negative HP entirely. But you also gain the dying condition, which has a number. You die when your dying condition reaches 4. When you go down to 0 hit points, you're at dying 1. But if a critical hit brought you down to that, or you critically failed a saving throw, and that's the reason why you're at 0 hit points, you're at dying 2 instead. When your turn comes up, you need to do a recovery check. You roll a d20, and the number that you need to meet is 10 plus your dying value. So if you're at dying 2, you need to roll a 12 to succeed on this check. When you succeed, your dying value goes down by 1. And if you fail, your dying value increases by 1. Now, Pathfinder's 4 degrees of success are in effect here. So if you roll 10 below the target number, you don't just fail, but you critically fail. And in this case, your dying value increases by 2. This means that if an ogre critically hits you, and at level 1, an ogre can critically hit your armored fighter by rolling a 16 or higher on the die, then you go straight to dying 2. And on your turn, if your recovery check comes up a 2, you critically fail and you die. Meanwhile, if you get a critical success on your recovery check by rolling a natural 20, your dying value decreases by 2. Whenever your dying value is reduced to 0, you stabilize. So it's like ping pong. Your dying value can go up and down. Theoretically, you could be dying for 100 rounds. Meanwhile, while you're dying, every instance of damage increases your dying value by 1, and if you're hit by, say, a spell while you're dying and you critically fail your saving throw to, say, a fireball, your dying value increases by 2. Meanwhile, if you're revived, you get to go back into the battle, but you're also less safe because we have the wounded condition. Whenever you would lose the dying condition, your wounded value goes up by 1. Now, what does this mean? If you are knocked down to 0 hit points again, instead of going to dying 1 or dying 2, depending on whether it's a critical hit, you go to dying 1 or dying 2, plus you add the value of your wounded condition. So let's say you're knocked out twice in a battle, and you're now wounded 2. If you critically fail a save against a Dragon's Breath now, you go straight to dying 4, 2 plus 2, and you're dead. Now, this all sounds pretty horrible and lethal, but there are several things that help the player characters out. First, hero points exist. They're a resource you can spend as a player. You start every play session with 1 hero point, and the GM can award hero points during play. One of the things you can use your hero points for is to prevent yourself from dying. If your dying value would increase, you get to spend all of your current points, minimum 1, to stabilize, and your wounded value does not go up. This edition does have a massive damage rule. You instantly die if a single source of damage is equal to double your maximum hit points. This is the most generous instant death rule yet. I'll note that I've only seen this rule come into play at first level and maybe second level. Also, we add hit points from your ancestry or race from other editions to your class hit points at first level. Being a human adds 8 to your hit points. These bonus hit points give a cushion at low levels. So our human wizard gets 8 from being human, 6 from being a wizard, and let's say 1 from a 12 constitution, and has 15 hit points to start with. Let's bring out our bugbear. The level 2 bugbear prowler attacks our fighter. Now, outside the first couple of levels, a critical hit will not kill you in this system, not one-shot you, at least the first such critical hit, because you'll just go down to dying 2, and that's it. However, at low levels, we're dealing with a massive damage rule, and our level 1 fighter starts with 20 hit points, and so this bugbear needs to deal 40 damage to kill them. Well, the bugbear does 1d8 plus 4 damage, so the most it can do is 24. It's not possible. 0% chance of killing the fighter. What about the wizard, who has 15 hit points? Well, the bugbear needs to do 30 points of damage in this case, and cannot do that. It has a 0% chance of one-shotting the wizard. However, I will note that the bugbear is a level 2 creature. I have seen one-shot kills in my experience in my games, usually from a level 3 or level 4 creature. Another thing to note that's important here is that, unlike every other system we've looked at today, you could have infinite sustain throughout the day. The medicine skill lets you treat wounds on an ally any number of times. There's no limit to how many times you can do it. This requires a successful check, but success means you get to heal them 2d8 hit points. And you get bonus hit points the better your medicine skill becomes. Sometimes you can add as much as 50 to that number when you become legendary in medicine at high levels. This has to be done outside of combat. It takes 10 minutes, and any character can have this attempted on them once per hour. So you can heal the party to full if you have enough time. And at high levels, let's say at level 15, a character with the right skill feats can auto heal every party member 40 hit points every 10 minutes, no roll required. And many classes can get focus spells that heal. Focus spells are rechargeable spells that take 10 minutes to recharge if you refocus. Meanwhile, the cleric is the master of in-combat healing with 4 bonus spell slots per day that can be used to cast the heal spell, and there's a 30-foot radius version of the heal spell. But the big thing to note in Pathfinder 2e that can be deadly is poison and persistent damage, which can be nasty. Your character can go down to dying 1, but if they're poisoned, they need to make a recovery check when their turn starts, and they need to make a saving throw against poison to prevent the poison from advancing. Every instance of damage, remember, increases your dying value by 1. And sometimes you're deep at, let's say, stage 3 of a poison, and a critical success only brings you back to stage 1 of the poison, and you still take damage. So if you're dying 1 and you're poisoned, and your turn comes up, and you do your recovery check and saving throw, if one of them is a failure and the other is a critical failure, you reach dying 4, you're dead. And persistent damage is quite persistent. You have to roll a d20 and get a 15 or higher to get rid of it. And there are also a few nasty effects that have the death tag. Things like the spell Vampiric Feast, which is called Vampiric Touch in D&D. If these effects reduce you to 0 hit points, you immediately die, no saving throw. You don't want to be at low hit points around those things. Alright, so what tier is Pathfinder 2e? I'm putting it in C tier. As my players will tell you, deaths happen, but after the first 1 or 2 levels, a well-prepared party can drastically reduce the chance of death. Also, as compared to 1st edition Pathfinder and D&D 3e, this system is more balanced and engineered like 4e. Those other systems are kind of an arms race where the GM is kind of bringing escalating challenges to deal with the party getting more powerful, without the system giving some stable math support. And those older editions have more save or suck effects, dramatic abilities that harken back to old D&D, things that can really swing a fight and say balance be damned. Closing statement. Here's my tier list. It is objectively correct. If you disagree, then you can object in the comments, but you'll be wrong. Which is the deadliest edition? They're very close, and there are a few things that make original D&D more deadly, but I believe the basic D&D monsters are a little more threatening. So that's the answer, basic D&D. Now let's look at our bugbear one-shot percentages chart. I will be the first to admit the inadequacy of this chart. It looks at a very specific and narrow situation, and the bugbear has an inconsistent lethality through the editions. Still, I thought it was nerdy and fun. But we can make a few general observations. There was a huge drop-off in lethality whenever people applied the -10 rule, and most players reportedly were applying the -10 rule, and that informed TSR first, and then Wizards of the Coast to make the game less lethal as time went on. 5e bucks the trend, having some surprising lethality at low levels, but that reflects the designer's intent at the time to basically have a big tent and bring back players of all the old editions together, including old school players. A design decision that they kind of walked back with a new version of the bugbear, and perhaps, I assume, with some other monsters. Another interesting comparison is that the early wizard had 2.5 hit points for the day, but 4e gave them effectively 50 hit points that they could access simply by resting. And in Pathfinder 2e, their daily hit points is theoretically unlimited. Another thing to point out, which is something that I've kind of glossed over, is that save or suck effects, save or die effects, in general have weakened or been eliminated in the game over the decades. They've become less impactful, and if they're impactful, it only lasts one round, or you get a chance to shake it off every round. All serving the overall idea of not taking a player character out of the action. So, original D&D and basic D&D are the deadliest, AD&D is close behind, 4e is consistently the least deadly, and 5e is kind of two games in one. It has a tutorial mode that's also deadly. But which is the best? The answer is that it's subjective, of course. It depends on what you're looking for. What I find interesting is that there's a reason for every single thing we saw. The game designers were tackling specific problems with every change as tastes have changed. We see here a general trend toward less lethality, and definitely a move away from one-shot kills, where a single throw of the dice can end your adventuring career, toward wanting player character death to happen only through a convergence of bad luck and making bad decisions. In 1974, Dungeons & Dragons, an offshoot of war games, was pretty basic. Go into the dungeon, explore, kill monsters, find magic items, get more powerful. The mentality of many people was like that in early arcade games. It was, how far can you get? If reaching the highest levels of power was virtually assured, then what was the point? Where was the challenge? Also, you often avoided combat in these early editions in order to find treasure, which was actually the main mechanism by which you leveled up. Gold equaled XP. Combat, as we saw in the earlier chart, was just too risky. Also, another big factor in all this was that characters were simpler, and re-rolling a character after your current one died was no big deal. But starting with, say, the middle of 2e with skills and powers, characters started to get more complicated. They got more abilities over time, and they became increasingly more of a pain in the ass to replace. And it was kind of a cycle. Having characters that hung around more, you also became more invested in them, which in turn had an effect on the kind of campaigns people would run. I did a video once on what I called the day the old school died, when D&D released 3rd edition. Link in the description. It was the edition when combat, even at low levels, was not to be avoided, and the focus shifted towards making encounters fun and balanced. You wanted some fairness because the expectation was you were going to fight them. And for whatever reason, we as a player base have wanted characters to last longer. PCs got more complex, harder to replace. We've wanted more of a power fantasy. We've wanted to avoid the disruption that a PC death could have on a campaign or a story. Still, we don't all want that, and there are people like me who like modern systems like Pathfinder 2e, but also want to play old school D&D, who want to have a deadlier game, and for us, these older systems are available. We have the privilege of living in today and having the ability to choose which system and style of play we prefer. So we're fortunate, and it's pretty cool. and we've come a long way from the days when a monster hitting your magic user meant you probably needed to whip out your backup character sheet. So that's it. Tell me in the comments whether you enjoyed this overview. Also, what system do you prefer or style of play you prefer? Also, tell me about other systems and how they approach death and dying and lethality. There's a number of systems that have become quite popular, especially since the OGL scandal happened, and I had originally intended to cover some of them, but this video, I'm thorough to a fault. This video was already too long and involved that I scrapped those plans. But I would love to hear about them. So that's it. Here's my outro. Support my Patreon if you haven't already. It gives you ad-free early access to most of my videos and exclusive content. And also join my Patreon. There are thousands of us, and I go there a lot. We talk about Pathfinder 2e and gaming in general. And we also have a drop-in, drop-out organized play system for Pathfinder 2e called Endless Tale Tavern. So that's it. I have been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. See you next time.